I don't understand why Trump is making these threats. Do you really think that this makes sense? It's typical Trump. He just operates by the seat of his pants, makes all these threats, then backs off. And by the way, if you're the Russians and you're watching this, you have to say to yourself, what does this tell us about dealing with the United States moving forward? Is there any hope for diplomacy? Is there any hope that we can work out some sort of modus vivendi with these people? I think the answer is no. I think if you're the Russians and you're the Indians and you're the Chinese and you're pretty much every other country in the world except for Israel, and you're looking at the United States, you have to say to yourself, this is a rogue actor. This is a rogue state. This is a state that can't be trusted. And you have to assume worst case. You have to plan for that, and you have to act accordingly. This is not in our interest.
I mean, if you're Russia watching this, are you kidding me? The unpredictability here undermines U.S. diplomatic credibility. It's like signaling to the whole world, friends and rivals alike, that policy is just improvisation. That breeds distrust and prompts other powers to plan for the worst, which is exactly how you drift into costly miscalculations.
Who knows? I'm a structural realist, and I believe structure really matters. And I believe if you're Japan and you're South Korea, the mere fact that you live right next door to China makes China a threat that can never approximate the American threat, because the Pacific Ocean is a huge body of water and we're far away. All of that's to say that from a structural point of view, there are very powerful incentives for the Japanese and the South Koreans to ally with the United States no matter what. But I'm sophisticated enough, at least I hope, to understand that structure has its limits. And one could argue that if the United States continues to misbehave, if President Trump continues to slap our allies around, and here we're talking about the South Koreans and the Japanese, who are two of our most important allies, that at some point they will be forced to work out some sort of accommodation with China, which will be to China's advantage, because China is far more powerful than either one of those countries, or in fact, those two countries combined together. So one could argue that, Trump, Trump made Trump's structure, if you know what I'm saying here, Danny. So I think we have to be very careful. I find it hard to believe that Trump doesn't understand that for purposes of containing China, it's essential to have good relations with South Korea and Japan. And slapping them around the way he does makes absolutely no strategic sense. But he just doesn't seem to care.
To my knowledge, structural realities should anchor foreign policy, but Trump seems blind to them. Geography favors U.S. alliances in East Asia, but behavior still matters. Keep slapping allies around and you incentivize them to accommodate China. That's strategic malpractice, especially when you're already stretched thin in Ukraine and the Middle East.
And by the way, just to take this a step further, the United States is pinned down in the Middle East, and the United States is pinned down in Ukraine. And that has made it very difficult for the United States to fully pivot to East Asia to contain China. You would think, given that situation, the United States would have a deep-seated interest in, if anything, being on better relations than ever with both the South Koreans and the Japanese. But what we see is the exact opposite, as you just described.
Seriously, we can't pivot to Asia but still alienate Japan and South Korea? Given U.S. overextension, alienating key allies defies any coherent containment strategy. Then we switch gears into the frozen conflict mindset, already gaming out post-war narratives before the war is even done. That shows Washington elites are preparing the spin, not the solution.
Just building on what you said, Danny, I think you can disagree with Putin's position, but he has been remarkably consistent in his pronouncements and his behavior. He has made it unequivocally clear from the get-go that there will be no ceasefire until there is a peace agreement. And he stipulated what that peace agreement has to look like. And he's made it clear that he's unwilling to bend on what he thinks the main terms of that peace agreement should be. There's no evidence whatsoever that he was telling Trump something different than that. All of the evidence is that he has been telling the same story over and over. So this idea that, Putin is deceptive, he's been leading Trump down the primrose path, making it look like they were going to have an agreement and then welching on the deal at the last moment. This is nonsense. This is the kind of rhetoric we get from Trump because Trump just tells stories. Facts don't matter to Trump, right? He just, tells stories off the top of his head. And it's to his advantage, he thinks, to portray Putin as the good guy and himself as Putin is the bad guy and himself is the good guy. And that's why we end up in the situation that we're in. We end up having to listen to Newt Gingrich spew this nonsense.
Putin's stance has been remarkably consistent. No ceasefire without specific terms. The idea he's luring Trump into false deals has zero evidence. This Putin lies all the time trope is political framing, not strategic analysis, and it clouds sound decision-making.
That's exactly right, Danny. That hits the nail right on the head. There is no evidence that they were close to a deal. None. Look, I've spent a big chunk of my life studying war, and I know a lot about air campaigns. And what people like Trump and Gingrich and others are trying to say is that the Russians are waging a counterpopulation air war. In other words, they're purposely trying to kill large numbers of civilians, much the way we did against Japan and even Germany in World War II. This is simply not true. There's no question that there is collateral damage. Civilians are killed when the Russians attack military targets from the air. But if you examine the targets that the Russians are going after, and you look at the small numbers of civilians who are killed in almost all these attacks, it shows very clearly that this is not a counterpopulation air war. It's designed to take out military targets, not to kill civilians. And in fact, Putin has been criticized inside his own country for not waging the air war aggressively enough. But the fact is he has limited the air campaign, which is extensive for sure. And again, it does involve killing some civilians in the form of collateral damage, a phrase I hate, by the way, but captures the essence of what's going on. But he's going after military targets.
I've studied war too long to ignore urban combat dynamics. Civilians die when battles happen in cities, regardless of intent. Both sides contribute to these tragedies, sometimes even against their own populations. The low ratio of civilian to military deaths here suggests targeting doctrine, not indiscriminate slaughter, and that matters in strategic assessment.
Two other points, Danny. And of course, I agree with what you say, but a lot of the fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians has taken place inside of cities. And as you know better than I do, when you fight a war inside a city, the defender is going to go into buildings. The defender is going to go into apartment buildings. And the offender, which of course in this case is the Russians, is going to bring a lot of firepower to bear to get at those defenders who are in those apartment buildings. And in the process, civilians are going to be killed. Again, this is the whole point about collateral damage. And the second point I would make is I actually believe that the Ukrainians have ended up killing a substantial number of civilians themselves. And I think this often happens when you have a war between two sides. The defender sometimes ends up killing some of its own people. But the more general point, which is supported by what you said, is that if you look at the everyday reports that are coming out on these air assaults by the Russians, it's actually quite striking how few civilians are killed. I think it's deeply regrettable that any civilians are killed, and I don't want to make light of that fact. But you will read the Russians launched this major attack, and Ukraine is saying 13 civilians were killed. Well, if 13 civilians were killed, you can't say this is the equivalent of Hamburg or Dresden or Tokyo in March of 1945. It's nothing like that, right? This is a bombing campaign that's aimed at military targets. Who knows? I mean, you listen to Gingrich talk and you just sort of wonder what universe is this guy operating in. I mean, the fact is we don't have a substantial amount of weaponry to give the Ukrainians. Pure and simple. This has been a problem that's been talked about for months now. The weaponry is just not there to give them. It's not like Trump has all of this weaponry sitting on the shelf and all he has to do is reach up and grab it and ship it off to the Ukrainians and in the process get our European allies to pay for it and we all live happily ever after. I mean, this is nonsense. We don't have the weaponry. And furthermore, as you and I have talked about before, at this point, it appears that the biggest problem that the Ukrainians face is actually not weaponry. It's not to say weaponry isn't a huge problem, but the biggest problem they face is manpower. And we can't solve that problem. And then you get to all this talk about secondary sanctions. I mean, we've said a few words about that. If secondary sanctions really were an effective tool, the Biden administration, which was deeply committed to winning this war against Russia, would have used them. They didn't, and they didn't use them because they're not going to work. And Trump can talk all he wants about using secondary sanctions, as can Gingrich, but I don't believe that Trump is going to use those secondary sanctions. And if he does, it would be a remarkably foolish move on his part.
Gingrich's big new sanctions and arms vision is fantasy land. There's no magic stockpile of weapons ready to ship, and even if there were, Ukraine's manpower problem is the bigger constraint. Secondary sanctions? If they'd work, Biden would have used them. This is political tough talk detached from logistical and geopolitical realities.
I agree 100%. I mean, the Russophobia in the West, and this includes, of course, the United States, is off the charts. And this is just evidence of that phenomenon. And I would say to you, sort of building on what you've said up to now, that it's hard to imagine when we are finally defeated in Ukraine, when this war shuts down, the shooting stops, and you have a frozen conflict, that the American foreign policy elite is going to accept its defeat and move on. We're not going to accept defeat. We're going to continue to do what we can to undermine Russia's position in the territories that it has acquired from Ukraine and in Eastern Europe more generally. We are going to have, in all likelihood, a very antagonistic relationship with Russia for the foreseeable future. And when you listen to people like Newt Gingrich and Senator Kennedy speak, there's just lots of evidence there that that's where we're headed.
Putin, as pirate with blood under his fingernails, is great for sound bites, terrible for diplomacy. Russophobia at this level ensures that even after a frozen conflict, Washington will keep undermining Russia rather than stabilizing the region. It sets the stage for decades of antagonism.